Hi, my name is Elsa Sjunneson. I'm a Hugo, Aurora, and British Fantasy Award-winning editor of nonfiction. I was also a finalist for the Nebula Award for Best Game Writing in 2020. I've been published in CNN Opinion. I've been published in the Boston Globe. I've been published at Tor.com, Uncanny Magazine, Fireside Magazine. My work most recently was featured in the Disability Visibility anthology edited by Alice Wong, and I've also had fiction work published fairly regularly over the last 6 years. I'm here today to talk to you about the art of the personal essay when it comes to disability. In order to talk about that, I need to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1985 with congenital rubella syndrome. When my mother was pregnant with me, she developed a rash and a fever. She felt sick, and then she didn't think anything about it until a bit later. And then she found out that it was measles, and then she found out that she was having me. I've been disabled since birth. For me, being disabled is a part of me. There is no Elsa Sjunneson without a deafblind component. That's just how it is. So my perspective matters. My perspective on the world is different from an able-bodied person. And part of how I fix the ableism in the world is by writing about my experiences and how they function and how I function and what the world does and doesn't do that affects me. So in order to talk about it, you have to understand where I'm coming from. I don't hear out of this ear. I wear bilateral hearing aids, which means that I basically hear differently than a hearing person does. I also have congenital cataracts. This eye is completely blind. I can't see it because there's a shadow, but I have an occluded cataract. And in addition to that, I also am low vision in my other eye, which means that I can see, but I mean, the screen in front of me is kind of blurry while I'm talking. So you may occasionally during this video see me bend over to pause. I will be looking at my notes because I can't read that far away. So if it seems weird, yeah, it's literally what I have to do to teach this class virtually. So I apologize in advance if it's distracting. So that's sort of where we start. I'm disabled. That influences my worldview. My body influences my worldview, and yours does too. You may be a person of color, you may be queer, you may be trans, you may also be disabled. You may not be disabled, but there are things about your body that influence the way in which you interact with the world. Think about that for a second. Where do you come from? What do you bring to the table? What's your perspective? Because when it comes to personal essay, it is coming from you. It is coming from the unique perspective that you bring to the table. A personal essay isn't just, I'm going to tell my story. Your story is great, your story is nice, but your story has a vector for a point. In my CNN opinion piece, rubella gave me a disability. This is my message to anti-vaxxers. I very clearly was talking about the influence of people who believe that vaccines cause autism with the intersection of my disability and how I got it, which is that I am a congenital rubella syndrome survivor. So I talked about those political angles of this is how this particular perspective affects me as a person who actually was affected by this thing that happens in the world. We get to insert ourselves into the narrative. We put ourselves in the narrative and we say, this is how it works. This is how we work. This is what happens. So that's what the personal essay is supposed to do. It's supposed to place you in the narrative and place you in a perspective. Your personal essay can just be a story. It can just be about what happened to you. But I find that the best personal essays are the ones that acknowledge that the world has an influence on us and that we have an influence on the world. So here we go. We're going to pause. One of the other things that I do in personal essay is I do a lot of media critique. So I look at representation. I say, oh, well, there's a blind character in this TV show and it doesn't really work. So let's talk about why it's important to represent blind people appropriately and how we could have done this better from the start. That's the kind of thing that I do. But why is it important specifically for disabled people to have perspectives in the world? Well, disability is the largest minority in the world. In the United States, we're about 26% of the population. In addition to that, we're also the only minority that you can effectively join in a split second. You can convert to a minority religion, but it takes years. You can become disabled because there's a truck and you met the truck with your face. So it's important to really look at how disability is put in perspective. It's important to listen to disabled voices because ultimately other people might become disabled like you or like me. And those stories and those narratives really matter. They matter a lot. It's important especially to think about making sure that disabled voices that come from an intersectional space get heard. We need more queer people who are disabled speaking out. I'm one of them, but we need to be able to talk about the fact that there are queer disabled people in the world. We need to talk about the fact that there are Black, brown, Asian, people of color, Indigenous people who are disabled. Disability to white is a hashtag by Melissa Thompson, and it talks a lot about how disabled narratives have been essentially colonized by white people. We need to do better. But moreover, when we're talking about disabled bodies, any disabled body, we need to acknowledge that the body is political. I have said this on panels hundreds of times, we'll probably do it hundreds more, but my existence in the public sphere is political. We are not that far out from the era of institutionalization. Disabled people have been put in homes away from their families and not able to live independent lives for a very long time. And as a result, we are not expected to be out in public. So by telling our stories, by opening up our experiences to the world, we are doing something political. This is an act of rebellion in some ways, to say, yes, I'm here, I'm out in the world, I wear pretty dresses and I wear high heels and I do all of the things that able-bodied people do. It is a radical thing to exist for some disabled people, less so me. I can pass to some extent. There are certain times when people don't realize that I am deafblind. As you can see, disability is on a spectrum. I am not like Helen Keller. I am oral. I do sign ASL, but I'm learning. So I don't need, well, actually I do need ASL, but I can't sign yet. So it's tricky. My experience as a deafblind person is very different from Haben Girma's experience as a deafblind person, but we still can interact and talk about what it's like. The ability of disabled people to speak about their experiences and to share their truths also knocks down this binary. It says, oh no, I've got 6 different deafblind people and they're all writing about completely different experiences. You see this a lot in the blind community and in the mobility impairment community. I feel like the deaf community still hasn't quite gotten there. We do a lot of pieces that sort of seem like we're all in the same boat. So if you're writing from your disabled experience, your voice does matter. You are not part of a monolith. You are part of a vast community of people who are changing the way that able-bodied people see us. And it's hugely important to recognize that there are voices out there that really do matter. At this point, it's important to acknowledge that disabled bodies have also been medicalized. So my disabled body has been narrativized by my medical professionals since I was a baby. My language around my body had to shift from a place of looking at it from a medical, what's wrong with me space, into a who am I and what is my identity space. Those are 2 different things. So as you work through some of the assignments that you're going to be given at the end of this, I hope you think about the language of medical versus the language of identity. What are the differences and how do they manifest in your language choices? Because ultimately it is important to shift from the institutionalization model, the model of disabled goes away into a different space from the able-bodied, into a place where we are integrated completely into the society. One of the other ways where we see this is in the concept of mainstreaming. In the United States, we often have special education classrooms where students with disabilities are sent. I was mainstreamed. I was in a classroom with a bunch of other able-bodied kids, but I definitely see how the lack of other disabled children affected me, and also how it affected my peers. When you only have one disabled classmate in a room, when you only have one disabled classmate and it's you, it does affect your perspective, and it affects the perspective of the people around you. All of this is to say, these personal essays do matter because they bring something to the table that's not just the same story. This is not an able-bodied perspective on disability. This is a disabled perspective on disability. So how do you approach this? Well, like I said, I do two different types of personal essay. I do the work that's on disability as a social issue, like in my vaccines piece, and I also do work on media. So if you're looking to write a personal essay, you need to figure out what your topic is and how you fit in. You may choose to write about, I don't know, your relationships. How does your body interact with relationships? How does your body interact with your workplace? Find a moment. It can be a central moment, it can be a larger theme, but find something that happened to you or that you experience that it shows something about the world that you're in. So you want to make sure it illustrates. You need to have that space that says, so this is what I'm telling you, and this is how it connects. And once you have those connective pieces, you can start to write around what your point is. You do want to have a perspective and a point of view in a personal essay. There are narrative essays that are more about just what's happened, but I think that the most powerful works that we have are the ones that do have a sharp edge. It's the pieces that tell us what it's like to be us and not just illustrative. I hope someday we can all write cozy mysteries about people in wheelchairs, but it's not quite there yet. I think it's important to make sure that you leave space to tell your own story. So you want to keep it focused on you or on the story that you want to tell. The other thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that there's a frame. So in my piece about vaccines, I actually opened the piece with a conversation I had with a friend who made a comment about how she wasn't sure if she was going to vaccinate her baby. And I had a reaction to that. And then I talk about my reaction to that and why I have that reaction and what happened to my body and how that navigates into what anti-vaxxers are and why it matters that we vaccinate. So it sort of follows a thread line. You want to make sure that you have a thread that your readers can follow. And sometimes this means introducing people to large concepts. So if you have a disabled body and you don't think that your audience is going to know certain things about it, you need to explain, but you don't want to do it in a way that's, you know, a introductory block of text that says, oh, I'm blind. This is how blind people exist. You use things that illustrate. It helps to navigate prose that way. Now we're going to do this thing again so I can look at my notes. So here's where we get into the tricky parts that matter for disability specifically. You need to keep an eye out for ableism. A lot of us have internalized ableism, and ableism is basically the discriminatory thought process, social pressure around disability. It's like racism, but it's not racism, it's ableism. So I highly encourage you to keep an eye out for things like making assumptions about other disabled people's experiences. I encourage you to not make comments about how other disabilities are worse than yours. You know, I spend a lot of time being frustrated because I hear someone say, oh, I'm not blind, I'm deaf. Or I'm not deaf, I'm blind. You know, it's like one of these is worse than the other. It's like, well, I'm both, so thanks. Or, you know, at least I'm not using a wheelchair. Like, well, that's great. My wheelchair using friends will super appreciate that they aren't that cool. So you want to try and protect people from you. You may have ableist assumptions, you may have ableist thoughts, but you want to try and do the least amount of harm. The next thing is that you want to make sure you're not buying into ableism. So that means, you know, you probably don't want to make comments about how it's okay to discriminate. And I know that that sounds really reasonable, like, of course I wouldn't do that, but you find yourself saying things like, well, it's okay to do this thing because it's not me. I see a lot of people who will say that, you know, guide dogs shouldn't be allowed places because they don't like dogs. And I'm like, oh, my guide dog is right over here and I need him. The other thing is you need to keep an eye out for yourself. And what I mean by that is when you write a personal essay, you are writing about you. The people who come to read your piece, they don't know you, they don't know where you come from, and they may very well have opinions about you and what you talk about. So you need to make sure that you protect yourself. Have a separate filter for when you get email in, but also think really carefully about what you do and don't want to share. We get to have private lives as writers. We get to choose what we share and what we don't. Some of us who write personal essay choose to share more than we might be comfortable with otherwise. Some of us choose less. I'm currently working on a memoir. It's called Alone in the Light. It comes out from Simon & Schuster next fall. And I have had to work really hard to create a space for myself that has a private life. I need to be protective. As a result, I'm using pseudonyms for literally everyone in my life. They're all pseudonyms because I want the people I care about, and even the people who I don't actually like, to have safety to not be called on by people who read my book. I also want to give myself that privacy to say, okay, so this is my world and I'm going to keep it as mine, even while I share what has happened. Disabled people are already visible. One of the other things that I've done, which may not make sense in this context, but I think it will help to understand what I mean. I'm a single, I use dating sites, and I use a pseudonym. Because it started to be this thing where I would be, well, hang on one second. So you get to pick what you choose to share, and you get to pick who you choose to share. I'm choosing to protect people if I can. I'm choosing to protect myself if I can. You may choose that for yourself too. I also encourage people who are in professions where they might be talking about what it's like to be disabled in their industry to consider using a pseudonym. If you're a doctor and you want to talk about what it's like to be disabled in your industry, you will be easy to find. There's not a lot of us. You know, I am a deafblind woman working in science fiction, and sure enough, people find my dating profile and they Google my name, and then they're like, oh, I just read 3 of your essays. And I'm like, nope. So this is why I use a pseudonym. But I don't use it for my work. I use it for the other things. I wish I had flipped that, but those choices are taken away from me now, whereas they exist for you. Finally, you know, you want to tell stories that matter. Tell the stories that mean the most to you. Make sure that you are telling what you want to tell. So while you are protecting yourself, I don't encourage you to protect yourself first. I encourage you to write what you want to tell people, and then you can come back, look at your draft again and say, what do I want to share? What do I want to take away? What part of my story is important to let go, to let free? So that's, I mean, I hope that this information helps for writing your own personal essays, but that's not all. You are now going to get 2 tropes from me. 2 tropes, no, 2 prompts from me. So these are prompts that I've used recently in prep for my memoir, which I think will help you understand more about how to write about disabled bodies. The first is a history of your body. So what you're going to do is you're going to tell the story that your body tells. And you want to divorce that from the medical history of your body. So what I mean by this is I obviously have a medical history. I'm telling the narrative of what has happened to my body in terms of how it has affected me. What is the history? Where do I come from? How does it work with me now? You may have that history too. If you're a mother, you may talk about how giving birth has affected your body, what that history is like. If you have a disability, you may do something more like mine. If you don't have those things, though, you have other stories to tell. You may have tripped and sprained your foot, and now it's not the same. You may have a mental health issue that tells the story of what it's like to be inside of your body. You want to try and talk about what that history is and where it comes from and why your body matters and how it's different from everyone else's, because our stories do come from our bodies. There is a narrative there. And the second prompt that I'm going to give you is that I want you to go and do some research and find a trope that, see, I told you the tropes were going to come back. Find a trope that applies to you. It could be any trope. It could be a blind sword fighter trope, which is what I'll probably use. You could pick anything. And it doesn't have to be about disability. It could be about any marginalization or any just body. Cis dudes who are watching this, there are so many tropes for you to pick from, but you want it to be something that either rings true for you, like it hurts, or you want it to be something that is actually accurate, or you want it to be something that's so completely false it's ridiculous. And then you want to break it down. Talk about how it makes you feel. How does it make you feel to have this trope exist? But also, how does it make you feel to think about whether or not it's true? What does it do to you as a person? How does it affect you? Because in media for disabled people, we are constantly seeing tropes that make decisions for us, that tell us what we should or should not be or say or do. And that's the key. You want to find what the truth of that trope is and then explicate on it. What does that trope do? How does it work? So this is two different ways of writing about disability and the body. In one, you are looking at your literal body and how it tells its story. And that's a very traditional personal essay narrative. On the other hand, you can do media, and then you can do a media critique and figure out how you critique media using your own body. How do you show the truths and the failures of Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Marvel? What stories are you going to tell? And what stories do they want to tell about you? Which I think is much more interesting. What are they trying to tell the world about you? What do the writers think you are? And is it true or not? In this first prompt for writing disability and personal essay, I asked you to consider writing a history of your body. I did this in the third chapter of my memoir, which comes out next year, and I had a really hard time with it. So what I did was I went and looked at all of my medical records from when I was a baby. And I started to think about how my body has been viewed in different ways. And I ended up working through the experiences of how my body is viewed and how it affects me. So in certain places, I use the legacy of the American Sideshow to talk about the ways in which my body has been viewed as a disabled person. In other spaces, I use the medical language that has been applied to my body. I talk about what's literally said in my diagnostic paperwork from 1986 when I was diagnosed as a congenital rubella baby. But then I also talk about what it feels like to be in my body. I talk about incidental things that have nothing to do with my disability. I think it's important to consider the ways in which your body is affected by things that are not your disability. So it was difficult for me. I'm going to read you a little bit from it. In adults, it's a mild disease. Most people never even know that they've had it. A 3-day rash, high fever, some tenderness in your joints. But if you're pregnant, it will attack the child you're carrying. According to the Mayo Clinic, 80% of fetuses exposed to rubella in utero develop congenital rubella syndrome. I am a part of the 80%. We will play with statistics in this book. The odds are almost never in my favor. But wait, there's more. Congenital rubella syndrome has the following conditions attached to it. Growth delays, footnote 2. I've always been small. I weighed 5 pounds 9 ounces at birth. My father was 6 feet tall. My mother is around 5'11". I am maybe 5'2". Cataracts, footnote 3. Bilateral cataracts were noted in my eyes at approximately 3.5 to 4 weeks. I had surgery to remove them on both eyes. Secondary membranes were removed twice more from the right eye. At present, the right eye remains occluded and hazy, a white-blue color that is mine alone. Deafness. Footnote 4. The first evidence of a hearing test for me is in 1996. I received hearing aids shortly thereafter, purple ones that were clear so you could see the inner workings, mild hearing loss in one ear, which has degenerated, and moderate to severe in the other. Congenital heart defects. Footnote 5. I was born with a septal defect and mild pulmonic stenosis. A large patent ductus arteriosus was ligated at 4 months old, and I have had a stable heart since then. But the scar, it traces my shoulder blade on the left side. It curves around to the left, leaving scar tissue, cutting through my healthy tissue, and pulling everything to the left side of my body. It causes me severe pain. Defects in other organs. Footnote 6. None that we know of, but honestly, CRS is weird and things could emerge over time. Intellectual disabilities. Footnote 7. Whether the dyscalculia is merely a part of the blindness or the CRS, we'll never know. So in this section, I play with a couple different things. I play with the medical language, I play with the actual diagnosis that's on the paper, and I talk about how it sort of fits in with me. I'm using a number of different things to tell that story. And I could have done it a million different ways. So it depends on what story I'm trying to tell. I wanted to make it clear that the medical language has been applied to me since birth. I felt it was really important to talk about that. And I think it's important to let disabled people find the language for their own bodies. We don't often get to define who we are. And some of that also comes down to just the language we use. I use identity first language, which is shortened to IFL. That's the disabled person, blind person, etc. There are people who use person first language. I don't know many of them. That's person with a disability, students with disabilities, people with blindness. I find it clunky, honestly, and I also think that it sort of is like trying to highlight that we're people first, which makes me think people don't think we're people. So I hope that this helped you find some language for your body. And if you're reading it back and you feel like it's not personal enough, or you feel like you haven't done it right, go back and try to find other language. Think carefully about what words you use to describe yourself and what you might want people to use for you. I think that this particular exercise is difficult, but I think ultimately it matters. If you want to write a piece about how your body is affected by the world, understanding where you come from will help scaffold. And in some cases, it will be the piece itself. I hope that you enjoyed having that experience and that time to process and to think. So now we're going to talk about tropes. I love talking about tropes. I think it's really fun. I think that tropes are the underpinning of how we understand society. So when we start to break down tropes and examine why they exist in society or how they affect people, what we're actually doing is reconditioning society to see things differently. I think this work is really important because so often the stories that are being told by the dominant paradigm. So everybody who has control, power, is the one telling the stories, and it's like history. The victors write the stories, and therefore we don't have the histories that we really want. It's the same thing with fiction. So in these tropes, we often find ourselves either correctly being described or incorrectly. I'm going to talk about my favorite trope because I actually am this trope, and that's the blind sword fighter. You see the blind sword fighter in a lot of things, mostly fantasy, but some not. You see the blind sword fighter in Shira Imwe, in Rogue One, the Star Wars movie. You see Arya Stark goes blind at one point in Game of Thrones. You see Zatoichi. So there are a lot of examples of the blind fighter. And it's basically a character who's blind, but who has superpowers, and they're able to fight people real good without seeing them, which is a trope. I mean, we see it a lot in media. Daredevil also falls into this example. So if we have this trope, where does it come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact that everybody gets really surprised by blind people being sneaky or fast. A lot of the time we think that blind people are slow and clumsy and run into things. Yet another trope. That's the Mr. Magoo trope. But when we look at the blind sword fighter, I think it's really important to recognize that there are actual blind sword fighters out there, and I'm one of them. There are blind people who do fencing and they don't see anything, and they are still excellent sword fighters, especially when it comes to fencing. There are wheelchair users who do fencing too. I highly recommend looking up those videos. So how does it work? Well, a lot of types of sword fighting are reliant on knowing where your person is based on how their blade touches yours. So it's a sensory sport. It is not merely about seeing where someone is. It's about feeling the space and understanding where you are. Blind people are really good at understanding where they are in space. So I think when I write about this, I often write about how, for me, I just wish that the blind sword fighter wasn't completely blind, because that's the trope that I find most problematic. The assumption that all blind people must be completely blind and unable to see a thing. Obviously, I'm wearing glasses, looking at a camera, and reading things occasionally, so I have some sight. Again, I think this comes from the notion that we are able to just look at someone and tell what they are. So as a blind person, everybody's like, oh, you can still see something, you're not really blind. And actually 80%, 90% of blind people have some sight. It's variable. Some have more, some have less. But for the most part, blind people can see something. That trope is the harmful one. It doesn't so much hurt their blind sword fighter characters. I just wish that they were, a little bit better, like I wish that they were written to actually be blind people and that they were played by blind actors. But this idea that you can look at a blind person and say, oh, they're blind, they can't see anything, and that's what's harmful. So when I write about that, I write a lot about how it's a safety issue. And that's how I approached my segment for this trope. I talked about how, as a blind woman, I often find myself performing blindness. I will put on sunglasses so that people can't see my eyes. I will walk with the dog. I will keep my head straight forward. I will lean into the tropes that exist that model what my disability is supposed to look like, so that people on the street who will say things like, are you really blind, won't have as many opportunities to do so. When I have the ability to create that safety for myself, to convince people that they should, see me as blind, I am safer. But that underpins something in society that makes it seem like having a monolith is a good thing. It's not. Disabled people come from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of experiences, and we all experience our disabilities differently. So when I write about this trope, I also write about how harmful it is to feel like you can't be seen and you can't be safe unless if you play into a specific belief about who you are. I think that goes for a lot of marginalizations in general. The only one that I can speak to is being disabled or being queer. But I think it ultimately comes down to, how do we tell our stories when we have to fight back against these tropes? And the way that we do that is by breaking them down. So I'm sure that you found something that said, well, you must be this. And when you found that something said you must be this, how did you talk about it? How did you break it down into pieces? What are the pieces that you ultimately came up with? Again, I'm going to read you a snippet in just a second. So in this section, I'm actually talking about the face-touching trope that we see in blind media, where a blind person reaches out and touches someone's face. And what I did for this was I actually asked my readers to do an experiment on their own, because I felt like it wasn't enough to just say, well, I don't do that, but I wanted people to understand why it's wrong. So I want you to try something. Feel your own face, or if you've got someone who is willing to let you put your grubby paws all over their face, do that. Close your eyes. What do you feel? Do you feel every pore? Do you think your fingers could really tell the difference between the slope of your nose and the slope of someone else's? The curve of a cheekbone? Will your memory remember the difference between one or the other? Would you trust your ability to feel the difference between a corpse, skin that has become hardened at the moments after death, and identify it as the same face that was alive, skin warm and pliant to your fingertips? I'm blind and I can't. I'm willing to bet that you can't either. So what I do here is I ask the reader to really think about what they think they can do and how does that trope really work. And that's one of the ways in which you can do this. So I hope that you found a way to look at these tropes that made you feel like you could connect with them and take them apart. And I hope that you enjoyed this class. It's been a pleasure teaching you, and best of luck with your personal essay writing. My name is Elsa Sjunneson. You can find me at Snarkbat on the internet, and I hope to see your work out in the print world.